Hi, welcome to Infodumpies. My name's Brianne. I'm autistic, I have ADHD, my pronouns are she, her, and y'all, I am turned on a weed gummy and I'm about to learn y'all how to speak autism. Welcome, this is a solo dump. Solo dumps, if you are new here, are when Violet takes a little breaky break and I take over the show to talk about a subject related to autism or the autistic community. Now, this episode was actually an idea from one of my clients, and they suggested I make something that autistic people could send to Allistic people in their life to help them understand our communication differences better. And I thought this was an excellent idea because when you're trying to explain communication differences to a group of people that assume you must operate the same way, things can get pretty heated. So I thought having me as a buffer made a lot of sense. Now, what are my credentials here? My credentials are that I have a degree in linguistics, and when I received my own autism diagnosis years ago, autism became a special interest all within itself because it answered so many things about myself that I had wondered for, 30 years. And of course, when I'm learning about autism, I am naturally drawn to learning about autism and communication. Now, if you're autistic, this isn't just for Allistic people. You can learn more about how you communicate and communication differences. And I can almost guarantee that there's something in here that you didn't know about Allistic autistic communication. And it might help you deal with talking to your Allistic loved ones in a way that makes more sense for you. So I've separated this episode into some different communication differences and different facets of communication. And before I get to those facets, I just wanted to give you a little preface of why it is important for Allistic people, which, if you're listening and you're not autistic, that's you. Allistic just means not autistic, and I'm going to be using that word a lot in this episode. I wanted to cover why it's important for Allistic people to actually understand autistic traits because it directly affects the autistic people in your life. There was a 2021 study titled, "Do Neurotypical People Like or Dislike Autistic People?" And in this study, people were shown videos, and they were simply asked if they liked or disliked the person in a survey at the end. They were not told that some of these people were autistic. More often than not, as you can see where this is going, when asked if they liked someone, they usually disliked the autistic people, often citing that the person was awkward or they perceived a lack of empathy from that person. All this to say, autistic people have social communication differences. Part of what makes disability disabling is that it affects our everyday lives. That's part of the definition of it. It may be tempting to think that an autistic loved one can simply learn to communicate the way you do, which to some degree we can learn it, but it's like learning a second language. And we're never going to be as fluent as our Allistic loved ones. Disability inherently means it's going to interfere with how we move about the world in our day-to-day life. Shortly after this study, there was a 2022 study called Effects of an Educational Presentation about Autism on High School Students' Perception of Autistic Adults. I really think they could go for shorter titles, but whatever, nobody asked me. For this study, 150 students between the ages of 15 and 19 completed something called the First Impression Scale after watching videos of 20 Allistic and 20 autistic adults in social situations. Some students watched these videos of these social situations after watching a 50-minute presentation on the daily experiences of autistic people, and that was followed by a Q&A. Some watched those social situation videos before they watched a presentation teaching them about autism. Students who learned about autism beforehand showed a modest but significant increase in the perceived likability of the autistic folks in the videos. So it seems that when non-autistic people have a better understanding of autism and autistic traits, autistic people are perceived more charitably. You have explanations for autistic behavior instead of just having what is a thin slice judgment, which people make within 6 seconds of meeting someone. Instead of having these implicit biases determine how you interpret this person's behavior, you have new information that challenges these biases and you can actually interpret us more accurately. So my goal with this is that if you are an autistic person and you want an Allistic person in your life to have more information about how you operate so you can really nurture that relationship together and understand each other better, that this will be a resource that you find helpful. And if you're an allistic person listening to this and an autistic loved one sent this to you, it's very clear they care about you a great deal. I'm hoping by the end of this, you can enjoy having more easy and less emotionally fraught conversations with them. Okay, so now digging into facets of communication. I'm going to start with the one that I think most people know about, and that is literal communication. Though most people seem to know that autistic people are literal, I still think there's kind of a misunderstanding in this regard. I know you don't mean it's actually raining cats and dogs. I'm not from Mars. I know you don't fucking mean that. But for me, this comes into play personally very often with things like questions. Allistic people often ask questions they don't really mean, or they'll ask something without ever uttering an interrogative phrase. So, when I was a kid, this showed up as a parent saying, "A lot of dishes in the sink," or "Do you want to take out the trash?" I don't want to take out the trash. And okay, there are a lot of dishes in the sink. Why are you telling me that? I'm quite literal. The subtext that seems very obvious to allistic people is not coming through to me. For autistic people, it is like the rest of the world has access to this group chat where they're saying this other layer of meaning in conversation, and they just kind of expect that we have access to that group chat. I can kind of use context clues to figure out what's going on in that other chat, but I'm never going to know for sure. It can also kind of show up when someone says things like, "Well, we haven't visited my mom in a while." Okay, unless you say something like, "Hey babe, we haven't visited my mom in a while. Can we plan to go visit her?" Your autistic loved one is probably not going to make the leap that you're actually asking, "Hey, we need to go visit my mom." Some autistic people, like especially high masking autistic people, like, I've grown up being, we figure those things out over time. There is trauma that comes with masking. So a lot of us can be hypervigilant, and a lot of things that you say, we may be, panicking, trying to go, "Oh no, what did they mean by that? Oh no, do they want something?" It can be really, really stressful to always be trying to find this second layer of meaning when we're functioning on the layer of the literal. So if there's an autistic person in your life, it's very likely that they have this internal dance of, what did they mean by that? Do I need to go do something? Oh my God, they mentioned the dishes. Do I do the dishes? They mentioned this. Do I do this? The best way you can help us out in that regard is to really practice saying the things you mean. And I know it's considered rude or bossy or uncomfortable to be that direct, but we are literally disabled. It is much easier for you to sit with the discomfort of being literal and direct than it is for us to try to figure out what 800 meanings of fine that you absolutely could mean. This also happens a lot with invitations. So you might have a coworker that says, "Hey, a bunch of us are getting drinks after work." To me, before I had gone to school for linguistics and learned about all of the social stuff with language, I would have thought, okay, they're telling me they're getting drinks after work. Have a great time. But that's an invite. I'm being invited. I wouldn't have known this before, and allistic people like to do this because getting rejected for an invite feels bad. So if you don't say, "Oh, can I come along?" or "Oh, where are you going? Oh, I love that place," and do this whole song and dance, allistic people just, whether conscious of it or not, don't want to ask directly because the rejection that would come with absolutely being direct and saying, "Would you like to come get drinks with us?" Is uncomfortable. So they don't ask it directly. They kind of let you invite yourself. But there's a really popular tweet that goes around the autism community that says, "I got that vampire autism. You have to invite me in specifically." That is the thing. Invite us. Like, again, we're quite literal. If your autistic loved one responds to something like this in a way that upsets you, I think one of the big themes of this episode is stopping and taking a minute to think about what you're reacting to. Are you reacting to what they actually said? Were you clear with them? Did you communicate clearly and literally what you want to say to them? Allistic people tend to value efficiency in communication, which often means saying things as quickly as possible and getting through things, pretty fast, but that is not how autistic people work. Autistic people, we tend to focus on, the literal, as I'm saying, but the actual accuracy of language. So if you can pause and think about what accurate language for that invitation is or that request, that will really open up a much easier line of communication between the two of you. This is especially important. This section is especially important when it comes to boundaries. Autistic people very often get told that we disrespect other people's boundaries, that we cross people's boundaries, but the problem is, unless those boundaries have been explicitly stated for us, we don't know they exist. We just don't. So being quite literal and explicit and saying, hey, I do not want to take phone calls about this subject after 4. Or, hey, I really am not comfortable with having so-and-so over for blank. Whatever boundaries you might have, right? They need to be explicit. And again, a big theme of this is Allistic people need to be okay being a little bit uncomfortable and to meet us in the middle, because it is so much less discomfort you have to go through by being explicit with your boundaries than it is to have this autistic person in your life accidentally cross them. Because I know I feel like absolute dog shit when I've crossed a boundary of someone's and not realized it because they weren't explicit with me, because there is no part of me that wants to do that to people I care about. So the next facet of communication I'm going to touch on is nonverbal communication, also known as co-speech behavior. This includes eye contact, body language, and posture, among other things. This is an area where I feel pressure to mask my autistic traits the most. Allistic people tend to see eye contact as looking at the other person's face. For autistic people, who are quite literal and prone to noticing little details, we tend to see the face for its constituent parts. So that means that when we hear the words eye contact, we mean staring directly into the other person's eyeballs. Contrary to what some misinformed doctors and professionals may say, many autistic people can make eye contact. All of our autistic traits exist on their own respective spectrums. I like to think about it as sliders in a character creation part of a video game. So for me, my discomfort with eye contact, that slider is probably just below the middle. I don't like it. It's uncomfortable, it's overwhelming, but I don't experience genuine pain like some autistic folks do. For me, it's like someone is seeing me naked, it feels too intimate, and I'm getting way too much information. I'm manually having to read facial expressions, and the eyes can give me way too much information to process. And that is going to be another common thing. There are things that autistic people can do, but we have to manually do these things. For everything we're doing, we're driving manual, and Allistic people are driving an automatic. So for me, if I'm focusing on making the correct amount of eye contact, I can't focus on my conversation with you. So if an autistic loved one is looking away, if they look at you and maybe look down, if they're just doing something else with their hands or drawing while they're talking to you, it doesn't mean they're not paying attention. In fact, they're probably paying much closer attention to what you're saying for the fact that they are not looking you in the eyes. Autistic people are probably not trying to roll their eyes at you if they're looking up and away. Sometimes there's just something worth looking at over there. And for any other parts of our body, like our hands and our posture, just because our arms are crossed doesn't mean we're mad. Just because we're fidgeting doesn't mean we're nervous and maybe lying. Just because we're, turned in a different position, maybe not facing you, doesn't mean we're not listening. These are all things that do not mean the same thing as they do when an Allistic person is doing them. So if you want to know if your autistic loved one is paying attention, you can just ask them. They don't have to be doing something else. I have clients who will be playing Minecraft in one corner of the computer screen while they're on a Zoom call with me in another, and they can most of the time repeat me verbatim after I said something. They're absolutely paying attention. Sometimes we just need to be looking at something else. And for Allistic people, the tone of what someone's saying doesn't just include tone of voice. Allistic people use these whole body posture and face cues to determine the tone of a conversation. So this nonverbal communication is used as a means of determining the tone of what someone says. The problem is, autistic people are speaking a different language in a large sense than allistic people. So when you see someone look up and away as an allistic person, you might think they're rolling their eyes, but they're just looking up and away. That's something that, when you're talking about actual language differences, is a false cognate. So cognates are things that are just the same in two languages. Like pizza is very commonly a cognate in a lot of languages. You go to many different countries and you can say pizza and they're like, yeah, I fucking know what that means. But a false cognate are things that might look like they mean the same thing, but they don't. So like if you're embarrassed, in Spanish, you would not say embarazada because that means pregnant. So when you're trying to determine tone in an autistic person, and you are looking at their body language and assuming it means the same thing that it means when you do it, it's probably a false cognate, and you shouldn't make these assumptions. And again, you can just ask. The next facet I'm going to talk about is empathy, and specifically the double empathy problem. First, let's get clear on what empathy is and isn't. So, empathy is the ability to understand or feel the feelings of another person. It doesn't mean how much you give a shit about another person's feelings. It doesn't mean how much you're capable of feeling yourself or your ability to feel feelings. As an autistic person with low empathy, I don't have to understand that you're having a feeling or what that feeling is to know that it matters or to be driven to action to help you. To go into the double empathy problem, Dr. Damian Milton, who is a lecturer on intellectual and developmental disability at the University of Kent, proposed a non-deficit-based way of describing the autistic experience of empathy and why we have so much trouble communicating with allistic people. This is the first theory that really looked at autistic social communication, not as a deficit, but a difference. The gist is that people with largely different experiences of the world will struggle to empathize with one another. In experimental conditions, it's been shown that non-autistic folks have a really hard time reading emotions of autistic people, and they also tend to form negative impressions of us right out the box. This alone shows that there isn't merely a deficit on the autism side of things. Allistic people have a hard time understanding a brain that expresses itself in different ways from their own, and just decide they don't like us before they've actually spoken to us. So there's a breakdown in reciprocity here, and as most of my clients would attest, when an autistic person tries to explain that their experience is different, we're often not believed. This can look like us trying to assure someone that we aren't mad, and we're often met with, your face says otherwise. Well, your tone says otherwise. Well, you wouldn't have said it that way if you didn't mean it that way. Some autistic people experience hyperempathy and may need to take a break from emotionally charged conversations too. We don't just experience sensory overload. It's more accurate to describe our overwhelmed states as being the result of a cognitive overload. So emotions, they are information, and that can also lead to meltdowns and shutdowns. So again, when someone's getting really overwhelmed in a conversation, and you have a conversation partner who has a completely different experience of the world, there's very little understanding that the overwhelm just has to do with the amount of information, and it's not a reaction to the conversation partner. This is another area where I think looking at autism as both a disability and a culture can be really helpful for allistic people. Disabilities that are marked by unique and different communication methods tend to form sort of cultures around our disabilities. So that's a reason why the deaf community is such a thriving, beautiful culture, is their communication differences. And in the autistic community, it's really similar. The way we communicate is cultural. There are cultural autism faux pas that allistic people make in autistic spaces all of the time. We have our own sets of cultural rules and expectations that if you sat down with an autistic person, they'd probably be like, oh yeah, I do think that's rude. Autistic people, we spend most of our lives trying to understand non-autistic people's social interaction. For me, it does feel like I'm Jane Goodall learning about chimps, not to call non-autistic people chimps, but it does feel like I am not of the same species sometimes, because things are so different. So if it helps to look at the double empathy problem also through a cultural lens and just understanding in this person's culture this might mean something different, I think that can be really helpful for non-autistic folks as well. All right, up next is infodumping. Like this podcast is named after. This is something that Allistic people are likely to know about, but I'd be remiss not to cover it. Infodumping is exactly what it sounds like, dumping a bunch of information. This is a hallmark of both autistic and ADHD communication. We tend to do this with topics we're excited about. This outpouring of information isn't an attempt to take over the conversation and make it all about us. Very often, we're expecting the same sort of delivery from our conversation partner. Autistic people have a nervous system geared toward interests. So if we found something interesting, we think it is valuable, and we very often want to share that thing of value with you. This is us giving you a social gift, really, because it's something that brought us joy or excitement, and we're usually wanting to let you in on the same feeling that this gave us. Infodumping gets discussed in the context of special interests and hyperfixations a lot, like this entire podcast, but it happens way more often than that. We might dump any information that we deem pertinent to a new acquaintance. This is like our back and forth social conversation, right? We don't do the back and forth question answer thing. We dump anything we think you need to know about us and then expect you to do the same. And we dump back and forth. And that is why many autistic people, after knowing each other for an hour and a half, know each other's childhood trauma and their blood types, because we just like sharing, and we often get told we're oversharing. But when you talk to someone who has the same neurotype, our neuro can absolutely meet us with that same energy. Now, Allistic people tend to have a back and forth question-answer conversation style when getting to know people. If an autistic person dumps about themselves to you, there's a good chance they're expecting you to do the same. You don't have to be a master of the info dump. Just understand this isn't us trying to commandeer things or make it all about us. This is us trying to get to know you and doing it in a way that our culture does. Okay, so the next facet of this I'm going to talk about is phatic expression. Now, I think most people don't know what phatic expression is, allistic or autistic, but we're going to discuss that. So, phatic expression is language that is often a component of small talk. Now, with phatic expression, the words a person says don't really serve any or much function other than a social one. So, oftentimes, allistic people see these phrases as just being polite. So, some examples. A cashier asking, "How are you?" They don't give a shit how you are. They're asking, "How are you?" You don't need to tell them about your day, and allistic people often understand this, and many autistic people do too, but some autistic people might not, because our traits are varied and many, and some might tell the cashier about the exact kind of day they've been having. It can also look like someone saying, "We should get coffee sometime," or a coworker saying, "What are your plans this weekend?" Or some stranger in an elevator saying, "Oh, some weather we're having, huh?" These expressions allistic people often use are to open up social channels of communication and let each other know that they're agreeing to interact in a social capacity. That cashier is letting you know that they're present, and if you need any help, they're going to help you out, and they've seen you. They're basically saying, hailing frequencies open. The person who says we should get coffee sometime is not expecting you to whip out your phone and find a date for you both to get coffee, most of the time. That is someone saying, "Hi, I've enjoyed meeting you, and I would agree to try to get you to know you better socially outside of this context." A coworker saying, "What are your plans this weekend?" is someone telling you, "Hey, I'm wanting to engage with you socially in this environment we're in this capacity, so I'm showing an interest and we can work together." The stranger in an elevator just wants social interaction. These are the same people who were dying about not being able to go chit-chat with people during lockdowns, and I didn't understand that, because I'm like, I get nothing from that chit-chat. A lot of allistic people do, so that person in the elevator doesn't necessarily want you to go into talking about how your grandpa was a weatherman in the Navy, so you learned a lot about the types of clouds. Not that I've had that experience, and this was actually an experience from my life. They just want to have a brief social interaction because it gives them that little hit of oxytocin and dopamine that autistic people are not getting from that. We mostly get stressed. So when an autistic person responds quite literally, again, we're back to literal thinking, we might be seen as weird or oversharing or overbearing, but we don't have the same type of social communication as allistic people. So sometimes these phatic expressions can lead to, our previous section, an infodump. Autistic people are not a monolith. We all exist on a spectrum of respective traits. So, I can only speak to myself and other autistic people I know, but for a lot of us, unless we're masking and trying to speak allistic correctly, quote unquote, we're not really going to use these a lot. Like, I do them to be polite in allistic society because I'm cognizant of it and I'm okay at masking. But if I'm just hanging out with the autistic homies, I'm not doing this. I'm just not. Because I know I don't have to. I get to speak my own language. So next we're going to talk about prosody. Things about language that are not actually part of the speech, like affect, tone, stress, pauses, and volume. Having a flat affect is a common autistic trait, but it doesn't encompass all the ways that our differences in prosody can show up. Many autistic people have to manually add tone to things we say. I add tone when I podcast because I know most people listening expect that. Many of us aren't aware of our volume as well, and this can get us accused of yelling when we're not really intending to. Autism is our entire nervous system, so sometimes this means that your brain isn't communicating with our body's internal volume control very well. We may often pause at moments that seem strange to allistic folks for many reasons. We might be processing, we might be choosing our next word, and tone and stress might not be things that we're consciously aware of. And these traits vary wildly in the autistic community. I'm someone who's pretty good at faking this when I need to, but not everyone can. And really, none of us should be expected to. So if the tone, stress, or pauses of what an autistic person has said are upsetting to you as an allistic person, again, let's practice taking a second before reacting and saying what was the literal thing they said. And once again, you can even ask for clarification. If you're an allistic person listening and you're noticing a theme, the theme is pause before reacting, think about what they literally said, and then just ask for clarification. And that takes us into the next facet of communication I'm going to talk about, which is seeking clarification and asking questions. This is a quick one, but it needs to be said because it's so common for allistic people to get upset about this. When autistic people are asking questions, it is most often not an attempt to argue. It's pretty safe to assume that we want the literal question we're asking answered because we want the answer for some reason, often for clarification. If you're working on something with an autistic person, like a project, or you're telling them about a plan you have and they start asking you questions that kind of expose holes in your plan, they don't think your plan is bad. They just want you to know that, hey, this thing might not work. Have you considered that? It's not saying they don't think you're smart. It's not saying that they're creating problems. This isn't someone challenging you either. So if someone in the workplace asks you a question and they're autistic, they probably just want an answer to the question. They're not questioning you or whatever authority you have in the workplace. And if you're an allistic person listening, letting autistic people know, hey, please, if you need clarification, you can ask. If you have a question, you can ask. And then actually letting them ask and not getting upset at them asking and taking them literally, that is such a huge way you can help. Y'all, we're fucking confused in social situations a lot. Some of us can mask how confused we are in social situations, but on the inside, very often, I'm just going, what the fuck is going on? Why do people seem mad? Do they seem mad? Am I understanding them correctly? What did my girlfriend mean by that? What did my husband mean by that? What did everybody mean by that? If I can just ask you outright, it makes communication so much less stressful, and letting the autistic person in your life do this without negative repercussions, I think will give you a much more authentic connection with them. All right, next facet I'm going to talk about is monotropism. Monotropism is a feature of autism. It's also present in allistic folks with ADHD, but to a lesser degree. Essentially, it's described as having narrowly focused attention with an inability to split our focus in other directions. As autistic people, we tend to pour all of our attention into one thing until we're done. This is where hyperfocus shows up. This is where flow state shows up. But this also has an effect on the way we communicate. Oftentimes, autistic people are accused of getting stuck on a particular detail of a conversation, and this is often misunderstood when we're in an argument. It can be interpreted as us piling on to something or getting hung up on something when we're really, again, trying to get clarification and understanding on a particular point in a conversation. We can't switch conversational gears too easily, so it also can look like a group conversation is moving on to a different topic and the autistic person is still stuck on the previous topic. Personally, when I'm stuck on a particular idea or part of a conversation, I find it really helpful when my partners focus on that with me until I can move past it. If I'm stuck on something, there's usually a reason. All right, next facet we're going to talk about are verbal processing differences and non-linguistic language differences. So there are some non-linguistic reasons that an autistic person communicates differently. These can be related to biology or co-occurring conditions or medications we're on. Literally any communication difference that doesn't have to do with the actual structure of language. So the first non-linguistic communication difference I'm going to bring up are meltdowns and shutdowns. Now, I could do a whole episode about these. If you're an Allistic person who's been sent this, you probably know whether or not your autistic loved one is prone to meltdowns and or shutdowns. I'm mostly meltdowns. I hulk the fuck out, and it sucks. It's the thing I dislike about being autistic the most, but it is very often misinterpreted by Allistic people. Autistic people experience the world dialed up to 11. When I talked about cognitive overload earlier, that is us processing so much information that our sympathetic nervous system is kicking in and we go into a fight, flight, or freeze state. Autistic people live like someone with an itchy trigger finger could pull the trigger on our sympathetic nervous system at any given moment. We could have a really hard day at work, and then we had, a bad sensory experience because we had to walk into a Walmart or something, and we could have been really confused about a communication we had with someone earlier, and then we could also have our chronic illness flaring, which gives us more sensory information to process. And then we get home and someone says, hey, can we talk about this thing? That can be kind of the last drop in the bucket, so to speak, of us being overwhelmed because we've just been dealing with all this information to process all day, that it can seem like we're overreacting to an interruption or a sound or something else. Now, I say a bucket because a bucket metaphor is really helpful. An Allistic person may be able to separate things like emotional stuff, sensory stuff, biological needs, all of these things. But with how hyper-connected autistic people's nervous systems are, we tend to have one bucket, right? So all of these stressors go in these buckets. There are certain things that help us empty these buckets, but sometimes we'll be in the middle of a conversation, and unfortunately, being misunderstood is a really big meltdown trigger for a lot of people, and we end up having a meltdown in the middle of a conversation. And most often, those are perceived as having a tantrum when they're perceived negatively, but the difference is a tantrum has a goal. A tantrum, someone wants something, someone wants some outcome. And when an autistic person is having a meltdown or a shutdown, there is no goal. It is not something that's in our control. Our sympathetic nervous system is kicked in. So this is like if you got angry at a bee for stinging you for getting too close to the hive. The bee was just doing what bees do when they're afraid, right? And they have to protect themselves or their home. It's like getting upset at a gazelle running away when they see a lion. That's innate to them to help them survive. And it is normal for autistic people who have had too much information to process to kind of like a tea kettle, if I'm going to use another metaphor, have things kicked up so high as far as the heat that the kettle starts boiling over. It's whistling. We can't do anything. We have to release this pressure because our brain has dealt with too much. Autistic brains at rest are processing 42% more information than an Allistic person's. And conversations are full of information. Your face and your expressions and your tone that we're trying to read to make sure we're understanding you. And again, we have to do it all manually. Those things are all information we have to process. So sometimes conversations can make us have meltdowns, and it's not us having anger issues at you. It's not us throwing a tantrum. It truly is something outside of our control. And I recommend, if you're an allistic person listening, talking to the autistic person in your life about what to do when meltdowns and shutdowns happen. We might not always know what helps us. I don't have the same things consistently help me with my meltdowns all of the time. But if you can debrief and kind of work on things together, and after they have a meltdown and they're recovered, say, hey, what could we have done differently? That can really help, because meltdowns especially there's such shame you feel after because you're made to feel like it's a tantrum. But it's not. It's not something we control. It's just an aspect of, many autistic people's lives, mine included. If we're talking about the video game sliders, I hacked the game to make my meltdown slider go even higher. It is one of the highest you could possibly do. So meltdowns are a big communication difference for me. Another common difference that is a non-linguistics communication difference is auditory processing disorder. And this is really common in autistic people. It can present in a number of ways. The part that's important in the context of communication is that spoken language may be processed incorrectly and need to be repeated. Or it might be that friend who you say something to and they go, what? And then when you're right in the middle of you repeating themselves, they respond as though they heard you the first time. They didn't. So my girlfriend, Violet, if you listen to the show, you know who she is. Violet has auditory processing disorder, and I could say something like, could you do the dishes? And she's like, you ate 30 fishes. And she's heard something completely different, but she knows I didn't actually say that, so she needs to figure out what I say. It's not that the autistic person isn't listening to you, it's that the thing that you said could have just been heard and processed completely incorrectly in their brain, and they need a minute. Another biological difference that has a lot to do with autistic communication differences is the fact that we don't undergo as much synaptic pruning as non-autistic people. So synaptic pruning is something that happens in childhood. So as babies, our brains go through extreme growth. And by 2 or 3, our brains start pruning some of these synapses so we can accomplish our most used functions more efficiently. Genetics plays a role in how much pruning one undergoes, and so does sort of a use it, you lose it thing. So things that a kid is doing more often don't get pruned, and the things they're not doing as often do get pruned, these sort of pathways. So by late childhood, allistic brains have pruned about 50% of the neurons that they were growing, right? But autistic people, we prune only about 16%. So again, this is why we are processing so much more information than allistic people, even while we're resting. We have all of these connections. So asking us a question, like, what's your favorite movie? We very often go, oh my God, in what context, what movie, what genre? How do I define favorite? Are you talking about favorite sci-fi? What kind of, it's not that simple of a question for us. And because of these increased connections in our brain, it may take us longer to process or produce speech. We may end up making a connection in the conversation that seems irrelevant to you because of our hyperconnected brains. We may get overwhelmed because we're trying to sift through 100 possible answers and data points that you've brought to mind by something you said. And again, this is a thing that can lead to us having meltdowns because we cannot filter out the important information. We're taking all of the information in. So you have a gentle trickle of information, like you're in the shower, and we are standing under a waterfall trying to filter things out. It's a much different experience for us. Think of it like roads in the brain. So as a baby, an allistic brain decides they needed to get rid of their tiny roads that they use to process social situations. And they build a metaphorical high-speed synaptic train from one end to another for social speech, right? The autistic brain, we kept most of our tiny roads, so when we're having these interpersonal conversations, our infrastructure is unchanged. So you've taken a high-speed train to get to the point of a conversation, and for many of us, we're still trying to catch up by taking these little 2-lane farm roads. So sometimes we may need more time to process things, and that's entirely biology. It's nothing to do with linguistics. And we might often have verbal shutdowns. So verbal shutdowns are when we lose the ability to talk or to talk easily. For me, this is a sign that I'm probably about to have a meltdown when I'm having trouble actually collecting words. And it feels like I have the words in my brain, but they're flying around like a bunch of angry hornets. And I'm trying to catch them all and put them in order and make them stay in order. And then summon the energy in a Herculean effort to get those words out of my mouth and produced into speech. So this is a really reality of the experience for a lot of non-speaking autistic people. Those folks are going to use AAC of whatever type they find most helpful. So that could look like sign language or, spelling or typing or whatever sort of means to help themselves communicate. So sometimes when I have a verbal shutdown, I end up using these means of communication to help myself. So if I'm having a verbal shutdown and I'm overwhelmed and I need to tell one of my partners something, I very often just type it out on the Notes app and show it to them, because actually speaking the words out loud is the thing I can't get done. So being open to alternative forms of communication like this can be really helpful for something that is a non-linguistic feature of our speech. There are also hyperverbal autistic people. I am a hyperverbal autistic person. And for us, it is kind of hard to process things without saying them out loud or getting them outside of our brain. A metaphor I use with clients a lot is like you're trying to clean a closet, but it's kind of easier to pull everything out of the closet first and then put it in order if you're organizing. So for hyperverbal autistic people, we kind of need to pull all the words out of our brain in order to make sense of a lot of things going on. This can be hard also when you don't want to just process everything out loud to your partner or partners or family, because I know y'all have other things to do. So if you're autistic and you're hyperverbal and you're listening, I really recommend writing stuff down. That helps me so much. It doesn't have to make sense. You can just be kind of doing thinking out loud, but writing it in a journal. It's also one of the main reasons I go to therapy. My therapist helps me verbally process these things. It's a safe space to do that, and I know he's got the time. And peer support. A lot of my clients come to me for that, to just verbally process what they have going on and figure things out. So my final category today is alexithymia. Alexithymia is a condition characterized by having difficulty naming, understanding, and describing our emotions. It's pretty common even outside of the autistic community, and it can happen with depression or traumatic brain injuries, PTSD, and a whole host of other neurodivergences. But it is so common in autistic people, it is the root of the autistic people are robots stereotype. So interoception is the one of the senses, and that is the sense of how your body and brain communicate. And for the same reason that I can't tell when I'm hungry, I also have trouble knowing what I'm feeling. So my body will be going through all the physical sensations of an emotion, but my brain doesn't get the memo of what I'm experiencing, and it doesn't tell me what feeling I'm having. I was 30 years old when I learned that being worried sick was literal, and that I was worried a lot. Because I was getting those physical sensations, my body was redirecting blood from my stomach to my heart and my lungs in case I needed to run. I was having the cortisol and adrenaline release, and I was having all of these actual biological things that accompany most emotions, which there are biological things that accompany most of these emotions that give you physical feelings, right? I experience all of the physical things, but I have to go through an intellectual exercise to figure out what those actual feelings are, because my body is not communicating it to my brain unless it is a hugely intense feeling. So again, talking about how I don't know when I'm hungry, I don't know I'm hungry until I actually feel sick because I've been hungry for a while. It is that extreme. So when it comes to feelings, unless it is an extreme feeling like, rage, I don't often know the nuance between mad, sad, and happy, and even sometimes I can't figure those out. And it's even more confusing because most of the time I'm feeling more than one thing at once. This is something that can be worked on to a certain degree, but also with our biological differences, it's never going to be the same as someone who can easily name their emotions, right? My interoception isn't really going to change. We may need more time to let you know how we're feeling as autistic people. We may need more time to process and figure out conversations that involve emotions. We may have a conversation and then realize a week later that we're actually pretty mad about that, or actually that made me sad, or that hurt my feelings, and not realize it until much later because we're just having to process that more slowly and go through a whole intellectual exercise about it. So if you're an Allistic person listening to this episode, if the autistic person in your life needs more time to figure out how they feel about you or a situation, it isn't a reflection on you. It just takes us a little more time to understand what we're feeling. And if you give us time to be able to name and claim whatever that feeling is, we can communicate with you much more effectively because we have the really important data point that we need to communicate with you effectively. Since we often get all of the physical sensations of an emotion while not really knowing what we're feeling, we can get sensory overload from emotions, right? So if you're talking to an autistic loved one and they have something that is getting them really overwhelmed, it's worth stopping to check in to see if some unnamed feelings might be the culprit. And if you're someone who says, oh, I think alexithymia is something I experience, I just wanted to shout out an app I really like real quick. It's called How We Feel. The app is free, but all you have to be able to say is whether you're feeling pleasant or unpleasant, high energy or low energy, and it gives you a really great sort of quadrants that have different emotions with names and precise definitions in them to help you figure out what you're feeling. And you can journal them and journal what physical sensations you're feeling at the moment too. And it collates all this data for you and helps you find patterns of how you're feeling. And I used it when it had a completely different name and it was in beta testing, and it really helped me figure out my meltdowns quite a bit too. So How We Feel app, I love it, recommend it. If alexithymia sounds like something you experience, I would really recommend giving that a shot. I know I've gone over a lot of very specific information today, but I figured in closing I would give you just some core ideas that I think really help Allistic, autistic, cross-neurotype communication. One is to slow down and think about the literal. If you're an Allistic person listening, I know efficiency in communication is something that you just naturally lean towards. But if you can meet us in the middle and pause and think about, okay, they're trying to be accurate. What are they literally saying? Am I reacting to their literal words? That helps us a ton. The second is to believe autistic people when we tell you what we're thinking and feeling. With a double empathy problem, very often when we say, hey, I didn't mean it like that, or hey, I'm not feeling this, very often Allistic people lack the reciprocity to understand that we're telling the truth. Often, Allistic people assume we must mean or be feeling the same thing they mean or feel when they make a certain face or use a certain tone or say a certain thing. We need reciprocity in this regard and for you to believe us when we tell you what we're thinking and feeling. Third is don't assume the worst. Again, very often, autistic people are just kind of disregarded before we've even been spoken to. If you're close to an autistic person and they've said something to you, please don't assume the worst. Please don't take the least charitable interpretation of what they said. And again, pause and ask for clarification. My next point is asking for clarification and be comfortable with that. Be comfortable with autistic people asking you for clarification because it's not a challenge. We really do want to seek understanding. And finally, get comfortable with alternative forms of communication. Speech is not something that is easily accessible to every autistic person all of the time. One of the core traits of autism is speech differences, and if you can open up your mind to alternative ways of communicating things and not hold speech up as the pinnacle of human interaction, it helps. For some people, a phone call isn't easier. For some people, it is fine just texting each other. You can have a serious, beautiful conversation over text. Maybe you learn some sign language to help your autistic loved one out when they're having a meltdown. There's so many different ways you can communicate with an autistic person that don't involve speaking, and that really helps autistic people who don't always have reliable speech. So if an autistic person sent you this episode, please consider these facets of communication. We do so much work trying to communicate in ways that Allistic people understand and trying to understand the Allistic way of thinking and communicating, that if you can just meet us in the middle and speak, metaphorical Spanglish with us, you will take such stress off of us and you will get such more authentic interaction with your autistic loved one. It is always going to be easier for the Allistic person to try to sit with the discomfort of communicating the way we do than for us to try to pretend we don't have an actual disability that affects our communication. You can do so much by just trying to learn about us both as a disability and a culture, and I think you can really take your relationship with your autistic loved one to a much deeper and authentic connection. And now, since this is a solo dump, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the housekeeping section. I'd like to thank our Patreon supporters like Dave Perrell, Steve Hernacki, Megan E., Carl Brooks, Natasha Neves, Laysan, Gus, Lutzi, Helen Clifford, B. Trossler, Kelly Brennan, Sewing Seraph, Rachel Rachelson, Fintago, Randy Lovings, and Stephanie Ritter. If you're a longtime listener, you know this. The best way you can support us is by telling other people about the show. We don't pay for advertising and we don't take paid advertisements, so word of mouth is entirely how we grow. You can tell people in your favorite Discord server, your favorite subreddit, your favorite, I don't know. There's social media is dying. I don't know. Wherever you lurk on the internet, if you think someone would find this valuable, you can go share it with them. And in the meet space, you can go share it with a coworker who's maybe discovering they're autistic, or, you know, a friend or a loved one. Just sharing about the show helps us grow. That's how we've grown our other show, Today's Lucky Winner, and that's how you've helped Mixnomer grow as a whole. And you can help Infodumpies grow our audience by telling your friends. You can also subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. This helps the algorithms know that people like the show and helps them recommend us to people who like similar shows, and also helps the show grow. If you are in a place to help us monetarily, you can go to the show details to find a link to the Mixnomer Patreon. The Mixnomer Patreon means that you get bonus material at certain levels for anything that Mixnomer does now and does in the future. Patreon is where you will find my comprehensive notes about this episode, including all of my sources. And, you know, there's a bunch of stuff for Today's Lucky Winner. And again, any new shows we do, you're going to get bonus material. So if you want to support us monetarily, Patreon is the place to do it. And if you want to come hang out with us, also check out the show details for a link to our Discord server. We have a weekly Stitch and Bitch where we do fiber art and chat together. It's international Stitch and Bitch. It's really great. Every Monday I do body doubling and we get work done together. We have really fun events we do, and the vibes are immaculate. It's a great Discord server. If you want to see what I am up to elsewhere on the internet, you can also check out the show details. I am mostly active on Instagram. I have Blue Sky, just don't know how to... I don't even know what to say on Blue Sky, y'all. I'm trying. But yeah, that is all I've got for you, my friends. Until next time, clever sign off.